Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So we've just had two speakers talk about how they don't think AI is going to have a significant impact. And I'd love to get a read on the room about where people are on this issue. So why don't we do just a quick show of hands, a quick poll. First, put your hands up if you are worried about the impact of AI on employment, either in a specific field or overall employment. Okay, so it's a pretty good number. And who is not worried about AI? Who thinks everything's just fine, nothing to see here? Okay, so it's about maybe half and half. Well, I'm on the same group as the rest of these, so I'm going to try and take a crack at that 50% that is still worried and see what we can do about that. So first, again, thanks to organizers for inviting me here today. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank. We have offices in Washington and Brussels. And we're really focused on the central question of how can policymakers accelerate innovation and boost productivity and growth for opportunity and progress. And so today what I want to do is talk about what I'd like to call the algorithmic economy. So if we look at the past 20 years and the trends we've seen in the economy, 20 years ago we were talking about the internet economy. So companies were competing based on what they were doing online and how well they could leverage the internet. Then we moved into the data economy, which is I think what we're really in today, where companies are competing based on how well they can exploit their information resources. But we're moving into the algorithmic economy, which is where companies are going to be competing based on how they can automate different processes and how they can make better decisions, all using artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is the use of software that can imitate intelligent human behavior. And innovation with AI is really one of the most important opportunities we have to use technology to increase productivity. And we're seeing AI being used across virtually all sectors of the economy. And we've seen, of course, many studies that have estimated that the economic impact of this transformation will be in the trillions. Last year, my think tank did a study where we tried to really capture the state of the art in terms of how firms are using artificial intelligence, how they're using this technology. And we came up with 7 primary categories for how we're seeing this technology being used. So first, monitoring. So we see artificial intelligence being used to detect patterns in data. So a great example of this is credit card companies, that they process massive amounts of data and they're looking for fraudulent transactions. We're seeing AI being used for discovery, so to actually seek out new solutions to specific problems. We're seeing AI being used for predicting. So this is everything from forecasting the weather or market futures to the type of personalization or recommendation algorithms that you find in Amazon or Netflix or some of these digital platforms. Fourth, we have interpreting. So this is when AI is being used to extract meaning from data. So we see this in everything from analyzing government documents or legal documents to using AI in a medical scenario to look at X-ray lab results and interpret these results. And finally, we're seeing AI being used for interactions. And this falls into 3 categories: interactions with the environment, interactions with people, and this is where you have a lot of the advancements in fields like natural language processing, computer vision, and interactions with other machines, both intelligent and otherwise. And we're seeing that firms are putting all of these different functionalities together to create some really astounding results. And with that, we're seeing AI that's actually able to beat humans at many different things, from playing games, which we talked about earlier today, to diagnosing health conditions, as was mentioned earlier, to even doing things like transcribing speech or lip reading, a number of functions. And so I want to show just briefly this video here that's, I think, illustrates one of the most important aspects about AI. And let's see, okay, we got it going. And so what I think is really interesting about AI here is that AI keeps getting better. And it keeps getting better because of something called machine learning. It used to be that if you wanted to program a computer to be intelligent, you had to actually program in those specific steps. But with machine learning, what you do is you teach a computer how to learn. And then it can start solving these problems on its own. So this is a video of a computer that's playing this old Atari game, Breakout. So at the very beginning, you can see it wasn't very good. It was missing all the shots. Right about now, it's been training for a while. It's starting to play pretty well. It's about as good of an average beginner human player. And what's really interesting is, as it keeps training, it gets better and better. And it keeps getting better. And so eventually it becomes not only as good as the best human player out there, it discovers a new solution. And you can see it here. Right? So it's discovered this new optimal solution for actually winning this game that no human can replicate. So at this point, the computer is better than any human that's out there. And this is the type of change that we're really seeing happen increasingly in many different areas. And so, get this going. Can we move to the next slide? This one's not working for me here. Great. And so, at this point, this is when people start getting kind of scared. And this is when people start thinking it will affect their job. And the idea is, I think, really well captured here in this poster that says, the bad news is the robot can do your job. The good news is that we're hiring robot repair technicians. The worst news is that we are building robot repairing robots, and we don't expect any more good news. And so this is really the headline that we're seeing play out again and again. Lots of studies are saying that jobs will be eliminated by artificial intelligence. The most notable one is this study from Frey and Osborne that came out 4 years ago that said 47% of US jobs would be eliminated over the next 20 years. They did that study again for the UK and had a similarly very high number. McKinsey Global Institute did this study a few years ago that said 110 to 140 million workers would be displaced by 2025. And these are the numbers that whenever you see an article about AI in the workforce, they're always referencing back to these studies. Even though it's been 4 years, every single article that you see is really going back to these studies. And there's some problems with that, which I want to talk about. But first of all, we've heard all these claims before. During the 1930s, a labor union wrote a letter to President Roosevelt where they were extolling the president. They were saying, we need to remove the loading machines from the coal mines. We need to complete all public work using only manpower. We need to take the tractors off the farm. And we need to go into the various industries and remove enough labor-displacing machines to make employment for everyone. And then a few years later, Congress was actually debating legislation to go and send the Secretary of Labor out to identify all the labor-saving devices that were out there and figure out how many new jobs they could create if they got rid of them. In the 1950s, this came up again. Congress created a joint economic committee that held extensive hearings on automation. And President Kennedy created an Office of Automation and Manpower in the Department of Labor. And this was an issue that was really at the top of his mind. In an interview in 1962, he was asked by a reporter about this issue of automation and jobs. And he said, "I regard it as the major domestic challenge, really, of the 60s, to maintain full employment at a time when automation is, of course, replacing men." This is a quote that could be said today, and it would not be seen out of place. Now, we hear all this history, and I think a lot of people say, but this time it's different. But what's interesting is artificial intelligence has also been around for a very long time. Although we're talking about it a lot more now, artificial intelligence goes back to the earliest days of computer science. And if you go back to the 1970s and the 1980s when AI was having a resurgence back then, we were hearing a lot of these same conversations at that time. So Marvin Minsky, who co-founded MIT's AI lab, said in 1970, in 3 to 8 years, we're going to have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. There was a labor economist, Gail Garfield Schwartz, who said in 1982 that with AI, as much as 20% of the workforce will be out of work in a generation. And then Niles Nilsson, who was a pioneer of AI at SRI Labs in Stanford University, claimed in 1984 that we must convince our leaders that they should give up on the idea of full employment as a goal for the post-industrial economic system. It's unachievable, unnecessary, and undesirable. So we've seen these exact same claims that we're hearing today in the past. Now, of course, all of that alone still doesn't mean that the claims are wrong today. So let's look at the specific claims today and why I think they're wrong. So first of all, if you look at the major study, the Frey and Osborne study, it uses a very weak methodology for deciding what jobs are going to be automated. They basically took a study from the Department of Labor in the United States that classifies different types of jobs based on manual dexterity and social perceptiveness, and it assigns it a number. It's basically a very straightforward formula. And it says anything that scores below, happened to be 0.7 was their cutoff, is a job that's going to be automated. But when you actually go and then look at all the jobs that they say are going to be automated, it's not a very kind of believable study. So here's a list of some of the jobs that they think are going to be automated with artificial intelligence. Manicurists, fashion models, barbers, carpet installers, drywall installers, installation workers, bicycle repairers, dental technicians. We actually had a robot fashion model at one point, and that never really took off. So we at least know that job's pretty safe for now. But of course, all of that doesn't mean that no professions will be eliminated, which is why I raised my hand and said no to the initial question. Very specialized roles will certainly be eliminated. We've seen this in the past. So for example, in bowling alleys, we no longer have individuals working back there to reset the pins. We have an automatic pin setter machines. But historically, this is actually quite rare. In fact, when we've looked back at the data in the United States, one of the few job categories, one of the few occupations to disappear completely is the elevator operator. And so up here is a graph showing the number of elevator operators employed in the United States. And so here's a quick question. What year do you think the self-service operator, the self-service elevator, was invented? So here's the employment numbers. What year do you think the self-service elevator was invented? It turns out it was invented in 1920. So it took 70 more years until the jobs of elevator operator were completely phased out. And there's a little bit of irony here because one of the last places where you could find elevator operators in the United States was actually in Congress. They just really liked people pushing their buttons to make their elevators go up and down. And I understand that in some countries they still have elevator operators where the cost of labor is significantly low. But it turns out that even though the technology may be available, it actually takes a really long time to see adoption. It also turns out that it's really hard to automate many jobs. And so what happens is that occupations, of course, actually change over time. So one use of AI that I personally use on a regular basis is a virtual assistant for scheduling meetings. So instead of doing the kind of typical back and forth where you say, can you grab coffee with me? Are you available tomorrow? No, I'm not available tomorrow. I'm available Friday. What time? You have all these emails that go back and forth. It's a big waste of time. There's a company out there called X.AI. You can use a virtual assistant that has that whole conversation in a completely normal conversational way with your colleagues, but leaves you out of the loop. And it looks at your calendar, it figures this all out. Now, of course, that's something that a real human assistant used to do in the past. When I started using X.AI, I didn't fire any assistants. I just, now the assistants can do other things. And that's really what we see in most of these fields. Occupations change. Humans and computers end up working together. And so one of my colleagues actually published a study earlier this year where they were looking at occupational churn, which is the rate at which some jobs expand and others contract, over the last 165 years. It turns out that occupational churn peaked at over 50% in the 2 decades between 1850 and 1870, and it's fallen to its lowest levels in the last 15 years to around 10%. So for all the concern that we have about what jobs look like in the post-dot-com era and the financial crisis and everything that we've seen with AI and automation even in the recent years, it was 1850 to 1870 where you had the most rapid change in occupations. So it also turns out that some of the predictions that we hear about are actually quite insignificant. So one of the studies that's often cited is from the World Economic Forum. And this predicts that there's going to be a net employment impact of between 5.1 million jobs lost to disruptive labor market changes over the period of 2015 to 2020, with a total loss of 7.1 million jobs. So 5.1 to 7.1 million jobs. And the headlines in the newspaper always paint this as this massive disruption, and so we kind of internalize that. But this is global job loss. So 5.1 million jobs lost over 5 years globally out of 3 billion workers. So 5 million jobs, 3 billion workers. That's nothing in this case. The second kind of misperception here, I think that the biggest misunderstanding, is that some people believe an increase in productivity leads to higher unemployment. But if you look at changes in productivity in many nations over the past 20 years, there's really no correlation with unemployment. And so this chart up here, this is showing the G20 nations. Not all of them are labeled, but all of them have dots on there, and the correlation between unemployment and changes in productivity. You can also look at robotics. So there's similarly no correlation between countries' adoption of robotics and job loss in manufacturing. These things aren't actually related, even though people sometimes think they are. And in fact, what we really need to be having a conversation about is productivity. How can we increase productivity? Improvements in productivity are the single most important factor in growing GDP, reducing poverty, and improving standards of living. Every 1 percentage point increase in productivity on the US side is related to 500 billion additional in the US federal budget. And even more important than that, in some countries, it's not just if we want to improve our standard of living, we need to increase productivity, but in many countries we have aging populations. So if we even want to maintain our current standards of living, we need to increase productivity. So for example, in the EU, as the working age to older person ratio changes, and it's going to change from 3.5 to 2.2 by 2040, we need to see a 13% increase in productivity to keep after-tax worker income from changing. So aside from population growth, most job creation has stemmed from productivity-driven increases in purchasing power for consumers and businesses. And the reason this happens is because innovation allows workers and firms to produce more, and so wages go up and prices go down. And this is what results in increased spending, which in turn creates jobs in all these other occupations. It's not more jobs necessarily in the tech sector, it's more jobs in restaurants, more jobs for doctors, pharmacists, and other areas. And in fact, this is what we see historically in the data. So in no decade, when we went back in this 165 years, in no decade has technology directly created more jobs than it's eliminated. So we know for a fact that technology does destroy jobs, but that doesn't mean you have higher unemployment. Because relative to the job technology is creating, it's eliminating today fewer jobs now than in any decade since World War II. The problem that we have here is that the jobs that are eliminated are often significantly more visible than the jobs that are created. So for example, we see the ATMs on the street corners. And so we see that we have maybe fewer bank tellers, and we think this is something that's happening, and we don't recognize the extra restaurants that are opened up, the extra hotels, the extra services. And I want to go back to the question that was asked earlier about, you're in a room with a bunch of entrepreneurs, and they want to see change, and then you ask people, do they want to see change? And I do think that actually people want change, because if you ask someone, if you had an extra $100,000, would you do something different? The answer is always yes. And again, we can actually see this in the data. If you look at the differences in spending between middle-income earners and high-income earners, we see that high-income earners, they want to spend that extra money. They want to spend it on more education, on personal services, on hotels, airfare, travel, new cars and trucks, furniture and new appliances, and even on insurance. And so, I think the most important message here is that countries should not fear AI. They should really be thinking about how can they embrace it. And unfortunately, we're seeing some disturbing trends in this area. And this is where I spend most of my time, is really looking at policy. So, we see efforts to have preemptive regulation that raises the risk of using the technology and lowers the return on investment. We see countries that are really applying what's called the precautionary principle instead of the permissionless innovation principle, which says we need to make sure that nothing goes wrong before we experiment with the new technology. In particular in Europe, with the General Data Protection Regulation, this is raising the cost on companies that want to share data. It's creating new rights, like the right to an explanation, that limits the use of AI in many fields. And I think what's troubling is that the EU is really pushing out these regulations through its trade agreements with many other countries around the world. And so there's a risk that not just Europe will kind of lose out in some ways because of this, but other countries will hurt themselves. And countries really need to be thinking about how they can embrace AI. There's a number of countries, China, Canada, even the UK, that have started creating national strategies around artificial intelligence. And what's interesting here is no country can really slow down AI for everyone. They can't slow it down globally. They can slow it down for themselves. And so countries should really be working on how can they better support R&D around AI? How can they help workers adjust? Because we do know that there will be an impact on workers. And how can they address the barriers to adoption, which is, I think, the piece that's often left out the most. Looking at the challenges of digital adoption, just like a lot of countries really spend a long time looking at broadband and creating national broadband strategies, we need to be having national AI strategies where we figure out how do we actually make this adoption work for us. To conclude, I just want to ask you to kind of think back to that video that I showed you of the computer playing this Atari game. And think about the AI at the very beginning versus the AI at the very end. Right now, every country is really they're in a race. They're trying to get their industries to be in that last part of the video. They want to be using AI so that they can win. And when they get to that stage, the countries that haven't made those investments are going to be like the very beginning of the video, trying to compete against the AI at the very end of the video. And they're not going to be able to do it. And that's why I think this important question that we're having today, where we're talking about the impact on workers, is important because we have to get over that fear so we can start moving forward with actually accelerating adoption, because it's going to be one of the most important things for national competitiveness in virtually every country. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.